Hello, everybody, and welcome back to a special episode of Inky Thoughts Podcast. My New Year's special. I know it's not very festive in the background, but I wanted to do this special to sort of have a look back and maybe also, in a way, a look forward to what the podcast will be in the future, but also looking at what I've done so far and trying to explain a bit more what my passions are. But I thought it would be more fun this time to turn the lens back on myself and let me be the interviewee instead of the interviewer this time. And as you can see to my side here, I've invited back one of my idols, and nowadays I would venture to say good friends, Beverly Yen Thompson, a sociologist and professor in New York, the state of New York. That is not New York City for those that are European like me. That is sometimes a difficult one to distinguish. But yeah, for those that don't know, I've promised to introduce myself. I'm Mass. I have a master's degree in sociology. I've specialized throughout my entire academic career in tattoos and embodied identity, so to speak, where I focus very much, in my case, on what tattoos mean and sort of the impact they can have on our own self identity, how we perceive ourselves, how we're perceived by others, social interactions, so forth. And I've been very heavily inspired by Beverly's work throughout the entirety of my studies. But yeah, Beverly, if you would reintroduce yourself, that would be awesome as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here today. My name is Beverly Ann Thompson. Yeah, as you said, I'm a sociology professor in upstate New York. And I was researching tattoos starting in around 2007 when I got my first academic job in Miami, Florida. And I started working on my documentary video of tattooed women, women working in the tattooed profession, as well as collectors, and subsequently wrote a book and followed with other academic research. But I really appreciate our overlap because I do feel like especially my book, came out in 2015. So it's a bit, growing older, aging,
Mm.
and things are changing. The social context is changing and the global context is changing. And so your podcast really brings us up to date, not only just with
Oh,
the
thank you.
academic reviews of tattoo culture, but also you're bringing in all kinds of different voices from the tattoo community and expanding that community. You have practitioners, you have academics, you have all sorts of people, collectors, researchers. And so it just really brings it up to what's happening now. And I really want to expand my research further also into looking at I attended a few years ago a conference called Queercation,
Mm.
which brought together queer tattoo artists of color, different marginalized voices within the community, but it's more specific to the US and even more specific to the
Mm.
Bay Area. So I do want to kind of expand into looking at different players in the industry. But
Mm.
between me and you, like we really kind of capture that old school tattoo
Mm.
ethic and practitioners, and also just how things are changing in such a dynamic way. So I really also appreciate your podcast and what you've
Oh, thank you so
brought
much, Beverly.
together in this collection.
I almost don't know what to do right now. I'm not very good at taking the praise. Well, thank you so
And
much for the
also
kind
just
words.
I think it's great, like our connection started, sociology, academic
Uh,
discipline, and you were writing academically and doing and trained academically to do those
mm.
kinds of interviews. But I'm also trying to break outside of the academy and just
Mm.
bring sociology to the public. What does sociology have to offer to the public?
Mm.
And how can we recreate our products, not just these boring academic journal articles that are, I mean, behind a paywall. Like normal
Yeah.
people don't read that
That has
stuff.
always been a pet peeve of mine. The whole, like, if you're not
Exactly.
tied to an academic institution, you're gonna have a hell of a time actually getting your hands on a lot of the new research coming out, even
Yeah,
though it's so interesting what comes out. But there's this, almost elitist sort of like hoarding of the knowledge in a way where it's
absolutely.
like you if you're not don't, because I get that some people that aren't trained to read it right might not understand the same from reading a research paper as you and I would, but they still would be able to engage more with a different side of things and learn something from it, I think, if it was
Yeah.
open source. I forgot the word for a second there.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. But it is written in just for specialty
Yeah,
folks, it's
that is
not
often the problem.
engaging.
It is another language how it's
Yeah,
written often. Like it's not as accessible as. I mean, that's one of the things I liked about your book. We already talked about. It is one of my all-time favorites, and I'm probably also embarrassing Beverly by talking about it as much as I do sometimes. But I loved that one, and also loved Michael Reese's book to some extent in that way, and Matt Lutter's works because you all write in a way where it's still academic, but it's also
yeah,
accessible. Like people can understand what you're talking about, and you explain the terms we all use in that to the reader. So they're not
right.
lost within this academic jargon that alienates the subject from them.
And I think academic books are a bit more
Yeah.
accessible. I mean, they are also
They
oriented
are
towards the
often journal
public,
articles are
and
way more like
yeah, those
another
are
level of it. But there's also way more
so,
elite, like you've talked about on your social media accounts and that, and your YouTube. There's a lot more elitism with article publishing,
uh-huh.
the different academic journals, and the criteria for publishing and how
Yeah.
it's reviewed and all that stuff. So
Yeah, the criteria, just yeah, the whole context of academic work. So it's really nice to get outside of that
mm,
onto into video, onto
mm,
YouTube, into places that are meant for the public. And
yeah,
so, and I think that's great for us sociologists to force us to be
yeah,
more interesting. Like in the college, you have this captive audience that, can't have any standards. And so academics read PowerPoints to their students, but we should try to be more engaging. What does our scholarship offer to the public, and especially to the community in which we are embedded if we're researching the tattoo community and engaging with folks that are, elevating also the practitioners to really providing some great information. Because, if I interview someone, they end up being just a sentence in an article, maybe their identity is hidden and stuff. And so I really appreciate just what you're doing on YouTube also with your
mm.
podcast is bringing, that person's voice, to the forefront.
Thank you so much. I mean, you do the same to some extent with some of your interviews you published as well, uh, especially with queer two artists you've interviewed where you had published it on your YouTube, but they're quite fascinating as well. And I think, as you say, it's important to put a face to it sometimes because we
Yeah.
end up, I think I had a hard time explaining this when I was trying to do my PhD sometimes, but I'll try and do it the best way I can now. I feel we sometimes disembody people when we insist too much on the whole anonymity thing for their sake, and it should be way
Yes.
more up to the person interviewed whether they want to remain anonymous or not. And oftentimes I think people don't want to be because there's a lot of they also gain something from the validity that's added to what they say
Yeah.
by being uh, face on with it, I think.
Absolutely. And those are just the standards here in the US. We have our Institutional Research Board and just
Yeah,
our ethics requirements that really
yeah.
push for that kind of, hiding the participants. And so that's what's great about being outside of the academy is you can do whatever you want. And it's not research, so that, it has those rules to it. So you're
Mm,
able to really, bring that. And so we met because of your academic research, but
yeah.
then you've also transitioned to outside of the academy to doing the podcast, which is public facing, working on with Tattoo Magazine and being able
Mm.
to write for the public, and then hopefully, having future projects that are oriented towards the public. But how was that transition for you moving from the academy and deciding to change from that type of writing to the podcast format and just the change in audience and your
Mm.
motivation also to want to make that transition.
Well, I mean, it was scary at first, mainly because I dreamt of having a PhD and felt that was my end all for so many years. Like I remember first wanting a PhD when I was 15, and then I was outside of academia for a long time after my master's degree and didn't really do much, like in and out of weird jobs and working in some not too great tattoo magazines and stuff like that. And then I finally, out of desperation almost decided to go for it and sell what I had and go do the PhD, and then it fell through. And the level of it, the politics of it, the requirements of it, as well as the economic side, all sort of came together and made it like I can't continue this. And then I'm, moving back to Denmark from Scotland because of Brexit and figuring out what am I going to do now. and first being like too scared to try and start something, even though I'd already sort of planned, like, okay, I should probably do the podcast. My supervisor said I should do a podcast. Maybe I should try again. And sort of trying to conquer that feeling of like, but if I do that, maybe I should instead just shut it all down and try and get a shitty job again and just, while away the days doing that. But I sort of try to bet on myself because I know I can't really live without trying to engage my mind and my analytical mind, I think, and my critical mind. I hope at least. I hate saying that because I always feel like I might not be as critical, analytical as I hope I am. But yeah, it was the transition in that way was great because the thing I couldn't do and I wasn't great at with writing academically was engaging in a way that I sort of felt looked down. Even with the really open-minded, progressive, and great supervisors I had, I still felt like when you really want to write for a PhD in that and all the requirements that are in that, it still always puts you up in an area where it's more like you're looking through a cage in a zoo. And I didn't really like that. Like, I like way more now where it feels like I'm networking and doing stuff, and it's still research in a way. I still learn a lot whenever I engage with people for my podcast, and I go in with an open mind, trying to be taught by them as well, and helping them bring their voice and bring some validity to it, and reanalyze what they might think and all that stuff. But what I really love is the whole, it's way more eye level between me and them. Like we're at the same point, even though they might sometimes be like, "Oh, you're the expert," and I like that and all that. And it's great to be told that. We all like that validation, but I still like that it's still way more like they say something and I acknowledge and listen and learn from that as well. Whereas I feel in classical academia, it's way more of a one-way street. As much as people try, like my supervisors did as well, in a lot of what they taught me, try to make it more progressive and more co-creation of data. I still think it always leans a bit more towards the slightly skewed towards, well, I'm the one doing the research, so you're the data I'm harvesting in a way. Uh, and I know that some people might disagree with that. And I know that some people, and I'm very happy about that, are trying to change that within academia. But I certainly like way more how I more directly and more personally and more openly engage with people in the podcast.
Yeah, I love that word networking. That's perfect.
Mm,
And just academia, yeah, there's literature written about how to be more equal in your research, but it just, the whole orientation of it goes against that. And so your podcast is bringing a community together. And also you're able to connect with these folks and work on projects, that come out of
mm.
your connections with those folks. And hopefully they're connecting with each other as well.
I would
You can
hope so. I mean,
also start to bring groups together, like have five people on a show that's talking about a particular topic.
I do like that some of the best compliments, I mean, some of the best things I've been told by participants, whether other academics or whether tattoo artists and that, is sometimes they'll tell me, "Oh, I never knew about some of these people. I'm so happy you're
Yeah,
introducing me to all these people." Because I like that. I have a very small community around the podcast, at least at the moment, but I like that they at least enjoy that thing with like discovering each other as well. Because that's
yeah,
the main driving force for me often. Not just that I want to push back against some of the stigma and prejudice, both internal and external to the tattoo community itself, but also that I want to always dream of promoting diversity. So I love when people say, "Oh, didn't know about this person, and I'm interested in learning more about them." That to me smells a lot like, okay, now they actually want to engage more with somebody that's different from them, you know?
yeah, definitely. Well, before that, just how did you get started as far as the very beginning of the podcast, but of course, just those initial reach people that you reached out to? How did you get those first few people and then onwards? Like it's hard to find the people, and it's also
Mm.
just hard to, it's easier maybe to make that initial connection, but to actually make it happen, to actually both show up on that one date. I'm sure that lots of people you
Mm.
had to reschedule and stuff like
Oh
that.
yeah,
That's
I mean,
typical.
especially with how many of my most, just about every no every person I've interviewed except for Maya Seeler have lived outside of Denmark. Even the one
Yeah,
other Danish person
exactly.
I interviewed lives in the UK, and that's not the biggest time difference. But I interview a lot of Americans, for example, and that is a big, like, that's also a big hurdle to do scheduling wise. But the way it got started, I mean, I almost want to say it's like the TV chef kind of way I got it started because I kind of prepared the meal from home. I contacted Robbie Ripple, who'd already been on a previous attempt at making a podcast I'd done that was tattoo related years prior. That I actually ended to do my PhD, ironically, because there were strict rules about doing media work and stuff like that, and you couldn't like without permissions and stuff like that. So I just shut that down to do the PhD. But we had such a connection when I initially interviewed him that he was so honored and happy to be the first episode and sort of talking to me about what the podcast was going to be, a bit like we're doing today. That was quite easy. That one. Some of the others I initially got was like a bit the same. People I knew already had met by chance, like Adam McDade, who was the third episode PhD and tattoo artist. Met him at the conference, inked up, marked out, where tattoo researchers met in London and sort of talked to each other and shared research. Chance meeting, we really got along, and he loved the chance to come and for once nerd out about his PhD for a long time instead of just a 10-minute presentation or something like that. And others like Cami, another very early one, was photographer I met by chance, loved his project, met him at the Scottish Tattoo Convention. He's from there, from Edinburgh, where the convention's at. So he was at the convention, talked to him a bit, and then we sort of hit it off. And so when I reached out to him, he already, knew me and knew I wasn't just like, I don't know, I don't think he might be that kind of person, but at least he knew I was safe and would be how I would want to engage with it, I think. A different thing where I was more surprised was when I reached out to Matt Davis because I'm always a bit, I always feel lesser. It's my own confidence issue, I would say, but he's a Howard educated psychiatrist. He's great. He's a heavily tattooed, avid tattoo lover and loves to promote like more acceptance in the workplace about tattoos. Never spoken to him before. I just reached out and told him that, hey, love what you're doing. Would love to interview you, especially about being a psychiatrist with a full bodysuit and hands and everything and still getting tattooed. And from what he would tell me about it later on, it's definitely the way I was so open with what I wanted to do, I think, and what I wanted to talk about with him that made him want to do it. Because we didn't know each other beforehand.
Were you able to also, as academics use the term snowball effect, or snowballing method, just from these initial contacts, were you able then to make further contacts with other people, or was it just you directly always trying to cold write to people from social media and people you found in general?
I'd say at the start, it was definitely way more like cold writing and just hoping they might want to do it. And there's definitely more than half the people I've messaged never got back to me.
Oh,
But
okay.
some did, and this
That's good to know, like we got
yeah,
to talk about our failures and just,
exactly. Like
not
uh
getting it. Because if we focus too much on successes, then people get turned off because when they try to
absolutely.
do
No, no,
stuff,
no.
they
Like most
fail.
people, and it's still a tiny, tiny podcast compared to others. So like, it's always gonna be a bit of a like. Some people
Yeah.
don't even notice if I message them on social media or email them, and they might not be interested. And I don't have any hard feelings or grudges for
Yeah.
any of that. Like that's absolutely understandable. It's more baffling to me when somebody extremely famous in the tattoo world wants to be on my podcast, which has happened more than I thought it would. But I mean, there's just this many where they might not never have seen the message. They might have seen it and not be interested. Some are very honest about it. That just tell you, "Hey, I'm not interested at the moment in doing it." Others reschedule so much that it just ends up disappearing into thin air.
Mm.
I know without even asking, you probably tried that as well, where somebody's like, "Oh, I don't want to do it now, but in 6 months' time, I might want to do it," and then you get back to them, and then it's like, "Oh, in 2 months' time," and then it slowly just peters out and never really happens.
Yeah.
That happened with one very famous British tattoo artist I really wanted to interview, where I mean, I've reached out a couple of times, and it's just, in the end, it just stops. They just stop replying, I think, because they just get so busy. But yeah, but there is some snowball effect as well, I think. And there's no way to verify this. But I think the fact of certain really big names following my otherwise quite small personal account does sort of give me this like stamp of validation that they at least acknowledge that okay, this guy is okay, and then they sort of others sort of want to engage with me more.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense.
Mm.
Later I would ask you, how things have changed and the different directions that have you've gone in that perhaps you didn't anticipate at the beginning. But for people that might not be that familiar with your podcast, just what are some of the general overriding themes or
Mm.
categories of people that you've interviewed and how those have expanded over time?
Mm. I mean, the overarching theme, and I apologize, I always ramble. I'm a bit difficult at defining stuff very like finitely, but the overarching theme for me has always been to promote the diversity that I already recognize within the tattoo world, which I think it both people outside of it and people inside of it sometimes don't realize or really recognize. So that was my like main mission with it, to show that well there are queer people, there are a lot of great black artists, there are a lot of great trans artists, there are all these cool people that want to do different things with it and want to reinvent it. There's also cool people that do it more traditionally. There's all this stuff. But then I also sort of the submission of that was also exploring certain themes I recognized. For example, talk to people about, well, what does social media entail for them? How does it feel for them to have to engage with this thing nowadays? And how big a part it's become of their industry, which often pops up. And that was not originally my plan, but it just became such a big theme for most people that I just engage with it a lot more now, how much of a space social media takes up in tattooing nowadays. But it also takes up a lot of space for collectors nowadays as well. And that's also where how community forms. So there's a lot of different things there. But yeah, I mean, showcasing diverse people and showing also what people might not expect. For example, I love my sub series I have with tattooed academics because I show people that, well, this guy is a fucking surgeon and he's covered in tattoos. This one's a psychiatrist. This one's an engineer. This one's a medical professor. I like showing all that because people don't expect this. I often feel people think, oh, you get one stigma and that's your box we put you in. So one of my favorite episodes to show that is the one with Professor Duncan Cameron, because he's queer, has ataxia and is wheelchair bound and heavily tattooed, and a university professor that's tenured, uh, within STEM sciences. So there's just so many things, and I think he kind of also loves, at least that's the impression I got from him becoming friends with him, how much he sort of subverts people's expectations quite often because they want to just have one thing, I think, to say about him and one thing to like one box to put him in and sort of one set of expectations to have about him. Like they'll be like, oh, he's a college professor. Okay, so that's tweed jacket, gonna go in, give a presentation. But that's not how he is. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. It's yeah, really interesting the folks that you've brought together and also just I guess your interview structure would be very different if you're doing this for an academic research project.
Yeah.
You'd have to have very sociological questions if that's your field. And of course, have the same questions for every person, and it would be very repetitive and boring. But on your podcast too, you're also kind of just riffing, like
Yeah.
you go off on different unexpected tangents and conversations that wouldn't be the questions from a traditional
Mm.
academic, if I was asking questions or if you were. And so your podcast is a lot more conversational
Mm.
and gets to the tattoo part in a variety of different
Mm.
approaches. So do you have something to say about just your approach to what conversational directions or questions you come up with?
Yeah, I mean, I always, even when I was in academia, loved semi-structured interviews, but I kept them very loose. And semi-structured, for anybody that doesn't know, is where you have some sort of question guide or just a guide you for yourself that in case you don't know what to ask or you get too off topic, you can sort of refer to that and try and, weir back to what you're talking about in that paper. And I do make them every time, but I mainly make them sometimes to like get on paper what I want to talk about the topic. And then to give my participant for the interview, my guest, I would rather say, a layout of, okay, this is what I actually want to talk to you about, because I don't like doing ambush interviewing, as I call it. I don't like being like having gotcha moments and what other stuff do sometimes, especially in some kinds of forms of journalism. I'd way rather have them trust me initially and form a connection and know that, hey, I'm here to support you in talking about this topic, how you feel it's important to talk about it as well. And that's also why I keep it so loose, because I've just figured out that if they feel it's important to this and relevant to how they want to talk about the topic, then I should also give that some relevance, because it's important to them, and their narrative and story should also be a way of looking at it. And that's also why I never give people like a set instruction for like introduce yourself this way. This is information I want you to give my audience, because I also feel that it's important that they set the scene for what they want people to know about them, to make it valid what they want to talk, what they're saying about the topic we're going to discuss. And some people really want to explain a lot. Like John Brocious, for example, talked a lot about his medical career to introduce himself. Others just name and profession almost. And that's fine, because I like to make them comfortable and make them sort of in control of how they're shown and depicted in a way.
Yeah, that's interesting to let them kind of take the reins and go in different
Mm.
directions. That gets to show their personality as well, and just they'll focus on things that it wouldn't have occurred to you to go in that direction. So, what were your objectives in the beginning of your podcast, and how have things followed through or changed at this point in the trajectory?
Well, I think originally I wanted to create a podcast that just would like showcase stuff. Like I didn't have any dream of having a massive impact or anything like that. Where I think nowadays I've rolled back some ambitions. Like originally I thought, okay, this is gonna be like take over where some tattoo magazines might be, and I might create this massive community and I'll teach them all how they should be viewing the world. But instead it became way more like co-creational. Like I also learn a lot from them. And now I've sort of changed it back to being more of a hobby and a passion project again, especially with wanting to change it into a book and giving it new life in that way. So it's sort of become, for me now, I like to call it like an open source data collection, like which I don't think I've at least never seen anyone do it before, but I might be somebody that's tried it before. But like, it's almost becoming like it's an archive of my qualitative data for the book, while also being its own thing where people can learn about this vast diversity I at least see in the tattoo world.
Yeah, I love that. That's exactly what I want to do too, because I think back at some of my big projects, and for each one, I interviewed a 50 people. And then I just might have, audio recorded that, pay for transcripts back in the day. And then only I get to enjoy that interview. And then it only gets reduced to a sentence or something like that. So it's just all this effort gets reduced to so little. And those people are pretty much removed from the whole
Yeah,
process. And
it's
so
a
I'd much
shame.
rather turn it around and just do the
Mm,
interview, have the interview be the focus,
mm,
put it out on YouTube, and other people, like you're saying, can use that as information. Because, like
mm.
for me as a tattoo researcher, when I work on my next book on the project, I can look at all your archives of people that you've interviewed and even focus on it in a different way than you would have. And so it just adds that layers.
Yeah.
So I definitely appreciate your archives.
Oh,
And I
thank you
think
so
a lot
much.
of, sociologists should think about doing research that's a lot more
Yeah, I think
folk
so.
facing and
It
focused,
also,
and put those interviews out there.
I also have a feeling that I always thought this as well, especially while I was preparing and doing my all the massive amounts of work you have to do to get ethical clearance to actually
Mhm.
do field work when you do a PhD. And I thought a lot about this, that like all this does, every step I have to anonymize them more sort of removes the pride
Yeah.
and their ownership in the data.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of participants, especially when you deal with marginalized groups, that actually would insist on having their face on it and their name on it, because they want
Yeah.
people to know what they've said and they want to stand by what they've said, especially if they feel it's important. And I feel having it out there like this acknowledges that way more, because as you say,
Yeah.
it almost erases them when you just have like one sentence in your paper, which you can't really avoid when you're analyzing stuff, minimizing it down. But you have
Yeah.
like one quote and then their name, and that's it.
Yeah. And
And,
most sociology is statistics based. You're just
yeah,
like one of
exactly.
these numbers and a big, big number,
That just
it's just
erases
like a
them even more.
survey. Yeah. And from my perspective, and for us in academia, I mean, we can look at your podcast and just it's also like we don't talk about methodology and
No.
how do you do interviews. I'm teaching sociology methods classes.
Mm,
And so also just that practice too, like of
yeah,
course I'm interested in that level of detail of how people interview people. And so this shows that,
yeah,
information right in front of you and it's a long form interview. So it shows how people engage. For example, your interviews could be used by people in studying communications or
mm,
studying sociology, anthropology, and I could have my students analyze this interview and look for, I mean, communications looks at body gestures and all of that kind of signaling that's nonverbal as well and engagement,
absolutely.
with people. So that would be interesting on that level.
That's
But the
actually why I
IRB
switched to recording the cameras side by side and publishing it like that, because I felt a lot was lost
reaction.
when Zoom just auto switched between who's talking. Because it's also
Yeah.
interesting to see the other person react to what's being said.
Yeah, exactly. Just these really kind of technical
Mm,
details as well. Yeah, because it's a dialogue, it's an engagement, and so it just really provides the participant, the interviewee to be able to speak back and to say, oh no, actually you should frame the question this way, and have their really input in the direction and the structure of the interviews.
That's
So
also
it's
why I give them the interview guide every time, because it's also my chance to tell them, hey, if I got some, especially if I'm dealing with something that's outside of my lived experience, for example, especially when I
yeah,
recently interviewed a trans non-binary tattoo artist, I want to make sure, because as much as I do to be progressive and diversely minded and inclusive, I can still fuck up. So I want to make sure
sure.
that they have a chance to tell me, did I get something wrong? Is there something I misunderstood? Is there something I overlooked, possibly? Something they feel
Yeah.
important that I'm not going to talk about? And most times I'm pretty good at getting around all the stuff. I've learned a lot of what I actually want to focus about and learned a lot from doing the podcast. But other times, they get a chance to very calmly and friendly tell me, hey, this I actually prefer this term, or I I kind of really want this to be a part of it as well, and then I get to do that. So they also get
Yeah.
more ownership and more part in the creation of this data, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's the important part. And you never see that backside of academia where the researcher is actually being educated by the participants and learning. I mean, all of us are human and we have our, various perspectives. We don't know everything, but it's through this engagement with other people that we learn and, learn what terms to use or learn just these kind of background stories that can help us develop as well.
But a lot of participants ended up feeling it so cathartic getting to get into these things in such
Yeah.
detail and discuss it with somebody that has, sort of more of a sociological lens that a lot of them were really grateful afterwards, which I never expected when I started
Yeah,
it. So many
exactly.
of them felt so like, for lack of a better term, especially since I'm an atheist, so I'm not keen on using more spiritual terms, but it felt almost cleansed in a way,
Yeah.
uh, or having gone through it, I think. And that's quite awesome. That's one part I got out of it. I just realized that I didn't expect and
Yeah.
sometimes it's what when I feel more down, because that's also a thing people should be more open about. I think it happens in academic research as well. Sometimes you just don't want to do it, and you sort of lose sight of the purpose of things, no matter how much you like
Yes.
doing it initially. And that sort of carries me through sometimes that, hey, it's cool to network and meet these people. And even if it sucks a bit, all the other stuff you do with, I have to do with editing and publishing and promoting, it's still so cool and cathartic for both me and the participant that I really enjoy doing it. And it sort of keeps me going in those moments.
Yeah, that's a really great point because that's true. We, as the researchers, think that we're asking this of this person to give us, it's a burden on them. But sometimes how you're saying it is, it's kind of like a therapy session,
Yeah.
They feel like, oh, I got to talk to someone who really cares and listen, that it's this kind of therapy. And I definitely have experienced that with my participants as well, which was unexpected, like that they really enjoyed the process and felt heard, and to
Yeah.
be able to talk to someone about maybe a topic that they've never even talked about before, or no one really cared or something like
Mm.
that.
I think that's also largely now I have never seen you. No, I have seen you interview on YouTube. Sorry, that was wrong to
Hmm.
say. But I think it's largely due to the conversational aspect as well, which I think you lean a little more towards than
Yeah.
other researchers too. That also leaves them with this comfortability and leaves them
Yeah.
with this sense that they feel okay. I can actually go in here while he's after he's done talking or something and add this to it. Because I think sometimes in more classical interview settings, at least from what I've read from others' case studies, people feel that it's almost inappropriate to correct the researcher in a way. Like,
Uh-huh.
do you get what I mean? Like,
Yeah,
they
definitely.
would feel it's out of place almost, I think, sometimes to go in and say, no, actually, I think you misunderstood this.
Right.
Whereas I think in a more conversational setting, they feel way more comfortable doing that. It becomes way more
Yeah.
back and forth.
That's a good point, because one of the research projects I have, many, but I would love to write a book on qualitative methodology, because I've
Yeah.
interviewed so many different types of subcultures. And so each
Mm.
subculture could be a particular chapter in a
Yeah.
particular lesson. But there's so much just interpersonal skills. Basically,
Yeah.
these are skills you would learn in the field of communications, of how to make someone feel comfortable. And so you and I both know that when you're setting up the interview, you're kind of chit-chatting with that person just to make them comfortable so that
Absolutely.
they can speak to you in a natural way. And it's so funny because, as you interview more people, you have all this experience. And so there's this one person that I really connected to. We had a real friend kind of vibe, but then
Yeah.
I turned the camera on and then she would freeze up, and speak like a very stilted and very close. I turned the camera off and she would flow and talk easily with me, and turn the camera on, and she just didn't come across very personable. And so, and flip side, another experience I had was when I handed my list of questions to, someone who was working with me, and had her ask the questions so that I could focus on the camera. And
Yeah.
she just read the questions like a robot, like, please tell me about blah, blah, blah. And I was like, oh no, it's all about the delivery,
Yeah.
It's like you got to talk like your
Absolutely.
friends in a casual way. And so that shows me that there's a lot of skill going on here that we don't even think about because we've been doing it for a while.
Yeah.
And it's kind of an automatic thing. But now that I'm thinking about writing about sociological
Yeah.
methods, it's like, oh, I got to spell that out, that you've got to develop these kind of interpersonal
Absolutely.
skills,
And I think it's also like I think we've always now not I'm not known you throughout your academic career. You've been more like the shoulder on my shoulder, being one of my most referenced authors while I did my undergrad and my master's degree. I know you fairly well by now, and I think we've both been drawn to what's qualitative methods from the start. Like we've both been sort of very drawn to that and talking to people and engaging with people one to one in that way. But others
Yeah,
seem very frightened of that, and I think that's very much a thing that needs to be grasped when teaching qualitative methods. That it can be way more down to earth, like because it's often, at least I remember from when I was taught it, especially in my undergrad, it was very much like, hey, you gotta be precise, you gotta give them credit, you gotta be very on top of it and know what you're gonna ask them and all that stuff. Whereas it
hmm,
can be way more explorative and conversational and for lack of a better term, casual. And I think that would make a
yeah.
lot more people more willing to engage with qualitative methods.
Yeah, yeah, because I'm thinking about, teaching a methods class, and it's like if you had three different students who interview the same
Yeah,
person, but different methods, different approaches, even just the style, how that
yeah,
would
absolutely.
elicit different information gathered, even if you're asking the same questions,
You can give them
just
the same
change up the
methodology and the same
delivery.
questions, and they would get
Yeah,
different. I would bet you they're gonna get different answers just from how they each handle that and present it,
yeah.
so to speak.
So what have you gained from that then, like your approach when you started, into how folks have kind of, you know, tweaked your methodology and how you
Mm.
talk to people?
Well, I sort of originally felt, oh, I really need to really get in there and really pre-research my participants extremely well. And this is going to
Mm-hmm.
be a real look behind the mask, but I sort of relaxed a lot on that because I like the raw feeling of really learning from them when I'm there. And I've already done, some research to figure out what I want to talk to them about. So instead of really continuously diving into, okay, all of the stuff, then you start way more rigidly preempting what might they want to
Yeah.
talk about and steer. And I'm way more into nowadays having them control the conversation a bit more. And I've also learned to be better at that and talk a bit less myself and let them drive the conversation way more.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's still a struggle for me because I do talk a lot, but I do try to, learn to let them be in the driver's seat because
Yeah.
I can't stress it enough. I really find it important to know how they view the topic and what they find important to the topic
Yeah,
as well.
that would be a good lesson that I would tell my students too, is something
Yeah.
like, I mean, yeah, we have to talk less because we want to get their information. We have to talk enough so that the participant is comfortable and wants to tell their story. And so to connect with them on that particular topic, like
Mm.
I might say, because you don't want to make them the other,
Yeah.
like you want to connect and say, oh, we have a shared experience. And so I would share enough of my experience just to get them going, just to get them to want to say, like, oh, I want to tell you mine, and then pull back. Because the more we
Mm.
say, the more we can kind of color or
Yeah.
misdirect their
And steer,
conversation.
like we can sort of
Steer,
lead
yeah,
them. Yeah.
that's the word, exactly. Because maybe we have different ideas or different
Mm.
opinions about a topic. Like we don't want to shut them down because
No.
they see that we're coming from this, other
Yeah.
perspective.
Well, I'll say another thing I learned a lot and I very much enjoy as well. And I do think that's another thing which makes it complicated, but I think it's important as well, is I do like giving myself into it as well to show, because it also
Yeah,
forms some comfortability, putting yourself in there and your own personal experiences so they don't feel alone. Because I think that's also a thing
yeah,
that happens sometimes
exactly.
with interviews, that they can sit and feel very vulnerable if you're hiding behind,
Yes.
some curated questions and not sharing your experience. Like this
Right.
this connection that forms when I'm willing to say, hey, this is when I started it, and this is when you compared to when you started it, and this is my experience, and this like I think there's I at least very much like that sharing as well. But I've always been an oversharer, so that came natural to me. I actually had way more trouble throughout my academic career with the more rigid versions of interviewing. Like that never sat
Oh,
right with me.
yeah. That's perfect because you and I are coming at it from different perspectives
Yeah.
then too. Because, for example, when I wrote my book, the one of the drafts that went to the reviewers, I didn't have very many personal stories in the book at all. And so the reviewers actually said, who are you? Do you even have tattoos? Like there's no information about you. And so you're probably laughing because you read my book and you know how
Yeah.
many personal stories I
Yeah.
have in my book. Well, all of those came on the second edit
Yeah.
because I went in and I opened each chapter then with a personal story and I opened the book with a personal story. But that wasn't there in the beginning because I didn't share. And
Mm.
so it was actually the editor who said, you need to share too and explain who you are in relation to your participants. But you're
I think it's a
coming at it
stroke
from
of
the
luck
other
because
end,
even when I've recommended your book to others and they get back to me when they've read a bit of it, they always really love the personal stories you put in. Like that's the first
Yeah.
thing they mention. Like, and I think
Yeah.
it's because it brings them into the academic stuff you want to talk about way more.
Yeah,
I think it
that's
sort of becomes
true.
a way of opening the door. For example, people love your stories about Kari Barber. People love that, not just because she's a tattoo legend, but because it really gives an inkling to your personal interest in tattooing and some of the stuff you've done to get participants in there and to get to interview people and to get access and all that.
Yeah.
I think that's really important. Like you've said as well, like bringing it down to eye level, so to speak, with people reading
Yeah.
the book as well. I think your personal stories go a long way for that.
And
Very
I
much
guess
so.
that also is because of my sociological background where we're taught not to include
Yeah.
ourselves.
Yeah.
But then I have a women's studies, like feminist kind of background in methodologies where you're supposed to include yourself. But I guess I do. in a lot of ways, like doing more academic literature or making YouTube videos, I see like, oh, it's based so much on the content. I need to add more personality and personal touch and personal story to these connections and information as well. And I actually, when I teach my students, I tell them explicitly in the instructions, introduce your topic with a particular news story and an individual person's story that can illustrate this sociological concept. You
Yeah.
talk about an individual, like they had this, wild experience, and you describe it. And then you say, like, sociologically, this is happens to one out of every 200 people, and this is a social issue, and go into it. But you need that personal story connection. And so I think for a lot of us academics, it's hard because we're taught to remove every personal stuff from our academic writing. But that's the whole point of having more
Yeah.
public-facing sociological content, is that you need to also be a human, in
Yeah,
this
absolutely.
material.
I tried to teach when I was teaching seminars and on the side as a teaching assistant when I was attending my PhD. I taught a
Mhm.
year, two courses a year, uh, Intro to Sociology 1A, Introduction to Sociology A, and Introduction to Sociology B. And what I
Mhm.
tried to tell them, I had I had three different groups of students
Mhm.
each semester. And I try to teach them every time that, hey, you absolutely need to look outside yourself, but also important to recognize the context within you experience these things.
Yeah,
Especially to recognize, for example, what privileges you might have, or how your worldview might make you see this topic differently to who you're interviewing, or who you're reading it from, or the statistical data you're viewing, or whatever it might be. Because
right.
recognizing your perspective is so important. So, and I do agree. Like I think they're doing more nowadays in some institutions to teach that. But traditionally speaking, there's a lot more of like, no, no, you don't matter. You're the surveying
Yeah,
sociologist
you're
staying up here looking
disembodied.
down at all this data and that, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, and you should just remain impartial. And there's a misunderstanding there because being impartial doesn't mean you can't involve your perspective. It just means you need to be critical of your own perspective as well.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And also how you affect the situation too
Yeah,
when you're engaged with other people. And so now you're
absolutely.
at this stage where you're transitioning and evolving perhaps further into writing for Tattoo Magazine,
Hmm.
writing more public facing within the tattoo community, but short form. But then you also are interested in perhaps putting together the podcast in a book. So where do you see these kinds of future directions?
Well, I think I really love the opportunity, I would say, that Inked magazine has given me in this case, where I work freelance for them right now. There's not many. Hopefully, it turns into more and more stuff I can do for them. But they basically let me write about these more culturally in-depth topics in a slightly more sociological way. Of course, I'm not going to reference tons of academic sources and all that stuff because you got to know your audience and these things. So it's not that people in the tattoo world wouldn't be interested in that. It's just it's very short form, as you say, and much more journalistic. So when it's relevant, I reference academic sources or other sources for some data, but also it's very much my analysis, which is quite interesting because people really took well, from what I can tell, to the first article that was published, which is currently out, about tattoo addiction, where I sort of gave my sociological take compared to a psychiatrical take from Matt Davis, The Ink Shrink. And compared to the book, that's way more of my own little, child. It sort of became like I kept thinking about wanting to do a book someday. Originally, I was going to do something completely separate but related to it, some, mishmash that I just ended up throwing away because I lost the interest. But this is way more like keenly in my interest because it's almost like I did the field work for my PhD by doing the podcast in a weird way, and now I'm writing my own project out of that. Like I know it's not going to be a peer-reviewed research project like a PhD project might be, and not as in academically heavy as that, but it still sort of feels like I get to do what I wanted to do with my PhD in a more casual form. Yeah.
And so how do you anticipate the book will come together? What's it going to look like?
So far, I've nailed down that I want to do a thematic analysis. much like I would do in PhD, but very much keep it
Mm.
smaller themes, like shorter chapters, smaller themes, and sort of use quotes and outtakes from different episodes. But I
Mm.
want to leave it in a way where it's very open where they come from. So I want to do a directory of my guests slash participants at the start
Mhm.
of the book with little vignettes that explain who they are and what episodes they've
Yeah.
been on and all that stuff, so that people can sort of look back and get the context of, okay, why is this person's quote interesting to include here, and they might be curious to see the interview as well then. Uh, but other than that, I want to do it where I initially explain my theoretical foundation, much like in an academic uh, book. Explain, okay, this is how I look at the body as a sociologist. This is what I look at, how I look at tattoos and how I define certain aspects of it, and then get into analyzing the themes I've recognized throughout the interviews and the academic literature, much like I would have in the PhD project, and using the interviews in that. Originally, I was playing with the idea of making each episode its own chapter, but I think that becomes a bit clunky, and it would sort of make the analysis afterwards very clumsy, I think.
Yeah.
So I think it's way better to put them in thematic groupings and then draw on the different interviews that are relevant to those themes, and
Yeah.
then sort of help people with the analysis after. I see the book very much as assisting the reader as well, and I want to
Yeah.
have a conversation with the reader. So after I've done, the thematic analysis, I want to, have a discussion afterwards where I sort of again engage with the reader and and try to help them recognize some of the important aspects of the different themes and what this means for tattooing and how it can be understood in that. Um,
Yeah. That makes
yeah,
sense.
I mean, I know that's a bit clunky, I guess, but uh,
It's a companion to the podcast,
yeah,
and you don't want to
definitely.
reproduce the like it's not like a transcript of
No, 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 I don't
the
want to do that. I
interviews or
don't want to do
something.
that. No, no, no,
Yeah.
no, no. I also don't want to include massive swaths of like long quotes and
Yeah.
that. I'd rather way more give my analysis and use quotes to like back up some of the things I say. And then people can always, if they want to, and I'm gonna absolutely encourage people to do that in the writing of the book as well. To go if they want to see where I get this from and where and have their own analysis of it, so to speak, their own look
Right.
at the data. They're free to go enjoy the podcast as an open source archive for it,
Right, exactly. And
which is
also
the
they
in
can engage with
yeah,
comments and stuff like that. So there's
absolutely.
some level of potential engagement. Hopefully your book will also include pictures.
I mean, I'm hoping to. That is the difficult part I'm dreading the most because some people I've interviewed a long time ago, and I'm hoping if I find a publisher that's willing to assist in it, that I might be able to get some good pictures of people in that. And I think you get it more inherently as a tattoo researcher yourself. I
Yes.
think it disembodies and alienates the person from the tattoo when you don't have the person pictured there,
Right.
whether
Right.
they're
Yeah, the
not
whole
visible at
person.
all or whether they are. I often have a pet peeve with especially articles where it's
Yeah.
like, here's a picture of a tattoo, but you don't show the person that's on.
Yes, yes, exactly.
That's strange to me because in a way, you could just have put it on a plastic cut off arm or something like that and said, here's the tattoo. You might as well just replicate it on a piece of paper then, if you're only
Right.
going to
Yeah.
depict the tattoo. It's that's at least how I see it. Like the relevance of it being on the body, it sort of disappears when you don't show the
Right.
body it's on.
It's literally objectifying the
Yeah,
person because
exactly,
you're just showing like
exactly.
their elbow or something. On the flip side, because when I did my documentary, I interviewed
Mm.
all of these, tattoo women artists and collectors. And then after one of the edits of my movie, people said, well, we didn't get to see their tattoos, like, yeah, we see them
That's the other part.
talking and you see the
And
tattoos at a
yeah,
distance. And so in the second edit of my movie, I had to actually go and put
right, yeah.
montages where I do a close-up of the
I do think I would
tattoos.
like to do a mix, because I always imagine that you have the person, like the dream version would be if I could get to photo shoot people, would be a
Yeah.
picture of them dressed as they normally would be or in the profession or
Mhm.
context we understand them
Clothes.
in. For example, if talking about Matt Davis, would be great to have him in what he wears for work as a psychiatrist. If it's a tattoo
Yeah.
artist, whatever they would wear to tattoo, that's fine as well. But then have them undressed
Uh-huh.
And then we can
Yeah.
zoom in on some of the individual tattoos, possibly, here and there if relevant. But the other aspect I really like as well, because I think a lot of people think that it becomes uniforms don't work or clothing don't work the same when you're tattooed. And I get in some aspects that's kind of true,
Mhm.
but in others it seems very weird and socially constructed. For example, with like Matt would say about physicians, it's weird that people think he can't be a good psychiatrist because his hands are tattooed and he's
Right.
covered in tattoos. Because it doesn't remove any cognitive ability to perform his job or any reflexive ability, any analytical ability, anything like that.
Right.
Yet, by the sheer fact of his skin being, tattooed, suddenly
Mhm.
the uniform doesn't carry the same weight for some people. Even though he
Right.
wears, the doctor's coat and all that stuff.
There's a book called Inked. Have you seen that? It's from quite a
Yeah,
while ago, but it shows like a doctor and then him in this doctor garb and then in the
it's
street
great.
clothes. Just playing with those stereotypes of basically professional work
London Tattoo from
stuff.
2009 did the same thing.
Okay.
Where it showed people in like what would they wear to work or street clothes, and then it showed them naked. That's why I got the inspiration to it. Like, and there's even some people I know nowadays that are in that book much younger than they are today. Like
Oh,
Dr. Matt
yes.
Lotter is in
That's
the book. He
fun.
both wrote the foreword, but he's also one of the participants in the book.
Oh, that's fun. Any concluding thoughts then as
Well,
we
I
look
think
forward and backward at your work and transitions?
I'm very happy I did this because I think I would have
Yeah.
lost my mind if I didn't get to use my mind for this work and
Yeah.
do something with what I view as my sociology, so to speak, and tattoos. I think I would have lost it. It's not very important to me, and I want to keep it that way. How popular it is. It's great if it becomes popular because it means more people might engage with it and learn something from it. But it's way more important to me that I get to engage with these amazing people, learn from them, and then learn from me. And we have this shared experience of like creating something really cool. And I hope that that keeps going on and that I could keep getting some new interesting perspectives on the podcast, as well as some revisiting ones, which I also enjoy a lot right lately, getting some people that have already been on with new topics.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be fantastic. Get someone that you've had on previously and then interview them, a new person with them. Have
Mm.
3 or 4 people because it would be really
Mm.
interesting to have that kind of group dynamic, just
I'm
like
I'm
we're
gonna have my
talking about.
first I'm gonna have my first multiple people interview in January,
Oh, great.
where I'm
Yeah.
gonna do a Valentine's Day special with for anyone that's seen the episode, it's out as we record this. It just came out with Jessie Silver, who's a tattoo artist who opened an all-female studio in
Hmm.
South Carolina. She's very awesome. She almost wanted to set me up on a date with her husband because he's also a tattooed academic nerd. And I thought, you know what? It's interesting because I can get the angle of Jessie being a mother who works
Yeah.
as a tattoo artist and also have the thing of like them being tattooed parents, but also talk about dating as a tattooed person and all that stuff. There's some interesting different angles I can get there with that couple, and I'm looking very much forward to interviewing them.
Yeah.
Very much looking forward to that. But I am planning on trying to figure out how I better. It's sort of also an experiment to see can I manage more people while interviewing over Zoom.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, part of, as we've said, the podcast is bringing together a community.
Mm.
I personally have met, through your podcast, so many different people that I didn't
Mm.
know. I've started to follow them on social media, and it would also just be interesting, like in the future, to organize like a lecture, a talk, or a
I would love to
community
do that.
discussion on a
It would be
theme.
an absolute dream. Do keep me in mind for yours. I
Yeah,
would
I
love
mean,
to
that's
go and guest speak and
this
guest talk
community
at lectures
part.
and that. I mean,
Yeah, because
absolutely. Uh,
it is a particular community. And so,
mm,
for us, you're doing a service too of bringing these people
yeah.
together and these voices together in this unified space. And so we can continue to grow that and talk to each other, like I'm sure
I hope
all of
so.
us have really
I
learned
hope
a
I can
lot.
keep you networking and really get like my ultimate ambition and final concluding remark, I'll say, is I can never shut up. Um, I would love to really make this into something for me career-wise because I don't see myself doing something outside of using my mind in this way. And I would love to, for example, I have many ideas and I think I need to focus and finish some of them. Like I'm very proud of having finished the podcast, so to speak, like actually doing it rather than just having the idea and never accomplishing it. But I also want to do that. Like, for example, you say, I would love to teach a course on tattoo sociology, just a basic one, like
Yeah,
more open one instead of highly academic, more like, here's an intro. If you get more interested, here's a lot of my friends' books and stuff like that you can
my
engage with and
God.
get more into the topic, because I think that would be very helpful both to people that are tattooers, collectors, and also other people that might just be curious. Like having a really truly open, like
Yeah.
class to teach in that way somehow. That would
An
be awesome to do, and I
online
want to do that.
synchronous
Yeah,
Zoom class where every week or whatever, every module, there's an actual, person that's doing a guest
I would love that.
lecture and that we could attend and engage. Like that would be so awesome.
I would love that. I don't know about the guest lectures, but I do want to, I am going to develop these ideas. I would love to have your thoughts on it as well. But yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I really would love to do that. I would love to finish the book. I mean, books are a big undertaking, especially when you've never published anything or written anything to completion before. So I'm hoping I
Yeah.
can finish that book throughout next year or the year after. That would be awesome.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely. And I think within the tattoo community, there's just this desire for community, but we're all geographically
yeah,
separated. And so if we could meet together, in an online space, that would be great to have these
absolutely.
conversations.
Absolutely. Well, I've
Yeah.
really enjoyed this as always with you, Beverly, and it's been an honor to be interviewed by you this time, and I really loved it.
Yeah, and thank you so much for bringing together this community and to pursuing this podcast. I know it's, such a struggle to do this kind of work, but it really is important and it's really brought together, a lot of amazing people. And so thank you for, putting this podcast together.
Thank you so much, Beverly, and thank you for all the work you do as well.